There is a moment in every life that seems insignificant while it is happening. A conversation, a compromise, a signature on a piece of paper, a relationship accepted, a dream abandoned, a truth left unspoken. Most people believe their lives are shaped by dramatic events. They imagine collapse arrives like a storm, loud, violent, impossible to ignore. But power does not work that way. Neither does surrender. The greatest theft in human history is not land, money, or kingdoms. It is the theft of a person's future. And almost nobody notices it happening, because it never happens all at once. It happens one decision at a time. The strange thing about slavery is that most people imagine chains. They imagine force. They imagine prison walls, but the most effective chains are invisible. The most effective prisons are entered voluntarily, and the most successful masters never need to give orders. They simply create conditions where people order themselves. Look carefully at the lives around you. Observe them without sentiment, without morality, without the comforting stories society teaches, and you begin to see a disturbing pattern. Very few people are living lives they consciously chose. Most are living the consequences of decisions they barely remember making. Years earlier, they surrendered a little freedom for a little security, then a little more, then a little more. And because each sacrifice seemed small, they never noticed the shape of the cage being built around them. Human beings rarely lose their lives through catastrophe. They lose them through accumulation. The accumulation of tiny permissions, tiny compromises, tiny acts of surrender. One day they wake up and discover they are living someone else's design. A design created by expectations, institutions, relationships, obligations, fears, and invisible pressures, yet nobody forced them. That is the brilliance of the system. People fight visible enemies. They almost never fight invisible incentives. A man will resist a dictator, but he will obediently serve a salary. A woman will reject direct control, but she will surrender years of her life seeking approval. A citizen will fear tyranny, yet willingly accept dependence, because dependence arrives disguised as comfort, and comfort is one of the most dangerous forces ever created. Comfort never announces itself as a threat. It enters life as a reward, a solution, a relief, something earned, something deserved, and slowly it begins making decisions on your behalf. The human mind has a weakness that predators understand instinctively. The desire to avoid immediate pain is often stronger than the desire to secure future freedom. This single weakness explains countless lives. It explains bad careers, bad relationships, bad habits, bad governments, bad leaders. The future is always sacrificed for the present, because the present feels real. The future feels distant, and power belongs to whoever can exploit that difference. Machiavelli understood something that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Human beings are not primarily driven by truth. They are driven by incentives. People say they value freedom, yet they choose comfort. People say they value honesty, yet they reward deception when it benefits them. People say they value independence, yet they spend years searching for someone else to make decisions. Watch actions. Ignore words. Actions reveal reality. Words reveal performance. The average person believes they are making choices. In reality, they are responding to pressures. Social pressures, financial pressures, emotional pressures, status pressures. The illusion of choice is often enough to keep a person obedient. If a prison door is painted brightly enough, most prisoners stop calling it a prison. This is why control has evolved. Ancient rulers relied on force. Modern systems rely on consent. Force creates resistance. Consent creates compliance. And compliance is infinitely more efficient. The remarkable thing is how eagerly people participate in their own limitation. Not because they are stupid, not because they are weak, but because the human brain is designed for survival, not sovereignty. Survival seeks safety. Sovereignty requires risk, and risk feels dangerous. The problem is that safety can become a slow form of destruction. Imagine a man standing at a crossroads. One path offers uncertainty but possibility. The other offers security but limitation. Most choose security, not because it is better, because it is predictable. Predictability calms fear, and fear is one of the strongest forces governing human behavior. Entire industries exist because people fear uncertainty. Entire governments maintain power because people fear uncertainty. Entire relationships survive because people fear uncertainty. The fear itself becomes a leash. No chains required, no threats necessary, only fear. Fear quietly guiding decisions, fear selecting futures, fear deciding destinies. The tragedy is that fear rarely appears as fear. It disguises itself as reason, as practicality, as responsibility, as maturity. People call it wisdom when they abandon possibilities. They call it realism when they betray ambitions. They call it responsibility when they surrender control. Language becomes camouflage, and eventually they forget what they wanted in the first place. This is where the real transaction occurs, not the exchange of money, not the exchange of labor, the exchange of identity. Every decision either strengthens the person you are becoming or weakens them. Every decision either expands your options or narrows them. Every decision either increases your freedom or increases your dependence. Most people never evaluate decisions this way. They evaluate comfort, convenience, immediate outcomes, short-term rewards, and because of this, they slowly mortgage their future. One payment at a time, one signature at a time, one compromise at a time, until eventually they discover something terrifying. The life they built is no longer serving them. They are serving it. At that point, escape becomes difficult. Not impossible, but difficult, because every decision creates momentum. Momentum becomes habit. Habit becomes identity. Identity becomes destiny, and destiny is rarely questioned. This is why the most powerful forms of control occur early. Not when someone is already trapped, but when they still believe they are free. The seed is always planted before the tree appears. The cage is always built before the prisoner recognizes it. A person does not wake up one morning and decide to surrender their life. They simply repeat small decisions long enough for surrender to become automatic. That is how power works, not through dramatic conquest, through gradual ownership, the ownership of attention, the ownership of priorities, the ownership of desire. Control the desires of a person, and eventually you control the person. Because people move toward what they want, rarely questioning who taught them to want it. This is the question almost nobody asks. Who benefits from your decisions? Who profits from your attention? Who gains power from your obedience? Who gains freedom from your dependence? The answers are often uncomfortable, because the forces shaping human behavior are rarely visible. The most dangerous influence is not the one you can see. It is the one you mistake for your own voice, and that voice is speaking all the time, telling people what success looks like, what failure looks like, what happiness looks like, what status looks like, what life should look like. Most never stop long enough to ask where those ideas originated. They inherit them, absorb them, repeat them, and defend them as if they were self-created. That is the final stage of control. When people protect the system that limits them, when they attack anyone who questions it, when they become guardians of the very cage they inhabit. At that point, force becomes unnecessary. The prisoners maintain the prison themselves, and the architects of power can remain completely invisible. The uncomfortable truth is that very few lives are stolen. Most are sold, sold willingly, sold gradually, sold one decision at a time. And the most frightening part is not that it happens. The most frightening part is how ordinary it looks while it is happening. Ordinary decisions rarely feel dangerous. That is why they are so effective. A person expects betrayal to arrive wearing a mask. They expect manipulation to feel sinister. They expect loss to announce itself before it appears. But reality is more patient than that. Reality understands that the strongest walls are built from stones too small to notice individually. One stone means nothing. 1,000 stones become a fortress. One compromise means nothing. 1,000 compromises become a life. The process is so gradual that most people never recognize the exact moment they cross the line. There is no alarm, no warning, no dramatic realization, only a subtle shift, a slight movement away from who they could have been, and toward what circumstances find useful. Human beings possess an extraordinary ability to adapt. It is one of their greatest strengths. It is also one of their greatest vulnerabilities. People can adapt to almost anything: freedom, oppression, truth, deception, prosperity, misery. The mind eventually normalizes whatever it experiences repeatedly. This means that a condition that would once have seemed unacceptable can become ordinary if introduced slowly enough. The first surrender feels uncomfortable. The 10th feels reasonable. The 100th feels natural. This is how dependency develops, not through force, through familiarity. Familiarity is one of the most underestimated forces in existence. People trust what is familiar, even when it harms them, even when it limits them, even when it slowly destroys them. The known suffering often feels safer than the unknown possibility. This is why so many people remain inside systems they secretly despise, not because they enjoy them, because they understand them. The prison has become predictable, and predictability creates the illusion of safety. Observe a person trapped in a situation they hate, a career they resent, a relationship they have emotionally abandoned, a routine that drains them. Ask why they remain. The answers will almost always sound rational. Responsibilities, timing, practicality, stability. But beneath every explanation there is usually something much older. Fear, not dramatic fear, quiet fear. Fear disguised as logic. Fear disguised as caution. Fear disguised as wisdom. Fear has a remarkable talent for changing its clothes. It rarely appears honestly. It prefers disguise. A man says he is waiting for the perfect opportunity. Often he is avoiding uncertainty. A woman says she needs more time. Often she is avoiding risk. A citizen says they are protecting stability. Often they are protecting familiarity. The language changes. The mechanism remains identical. The avoidance of discomfort. Power understands this better than most people understand themselves. Those who influence others do not necessarily need intelligence superior to everyone else. They simply need a more accurate understanding of human behavior. And human behavior follows patterns. Predictable patterns, repeated patterns, patterns that have remained largely unchanged for centuries. People seek approval. People avoid rejection. People fear exclusion. People pursue status. People crave certainty. People protect self-images. Once these patterns are understood, influence becomes far easier than most imagine. Consider how often people make decisions they know are wrong, not because they lack information, because they fear consequences. Not consequences from reality, consequences from other people. The fear of social punishment controls countless lives. Humans evolved in groups. For most of history, exclusion could mean death. The modern world has changed. The nervous system has not. The primitive mind still interprets rejection as danger. It still interprets disapproval as threat. It still interprets exclusion as survival risk. And because of this, many people spend years making decisions designed to avoid judgment, not to improve their lives, not to increase freedom, not to pursue truth, simply to avoid disapproval. This creates a peculiar phenomenon. People become actors inside their own existence, performing versions of themselves that others find acceptable, gradually forgetting the distinction between performance and identity. The role becomes permanent. The mask becomes the face. The audience becomes the master. And eventually they discover that nearly every important decision has been made for spectators, not for themselves, for parents, for friends, for partners, for society, for strangers, for people who will never carry the consequences. The tragedy is not merely that people seek approval. The tragedy is that approval can become addictive. Like any addiction, tolerance develops. The first validation feels powerful. Soon it becomes insufficient. More validation is required. More recognition, more acceptance, more reassurance. The appetite grows, and with each increase in appetite, independence decreases. Because dependence is not always financial. Dependence can be emotional, social, psychological. A person who requires constant approval is no less dependent than a person who requires constant money. Both have surrendered autonomy. Both have handed power to external forces. Both can be controlled. The methods simply differ. Machiavelli understood something uncomfortable about human loyalty. Most loyalty is conditional. People dislike admitting this. It conflicts with their self-image. But observe behavior carefully. Loyalty often survives only while incentives remain aligned. Friendships dissolve over opportunities. Partnerships dissolve over advantages. Promises dissolve under pressure. Principles dissolve when costs become significant. This is not evidence of evil. It is evidence of self-interest. Self-interest is one of the most reliable forces in existence. People often describe themselves according to values. Reality describes them according to incentives. When values and incentives align, character appears strong. When they collide, reality emerges. The collision reveals everything. This is why many individuals spend their lives misunderstanding others. They listen to declarations. They ignore incentives. They believe words. They overlook behavior. Then they are shocked when outcomes reveal a different truth. The truth was always visible. They simply preferred a more comforting interpretation. Comforting interpretations are expensive. Eventually, reality collects payment. Reality always collects payment. A person can ignore truth. Reality cannot. A person can deny consequences. Reality cannot. A person can create stories. Reality remains indifferent. This indifference is one of the harshest lessons most people encounter. The world does not reward intentions. It rewards outcomes. The world does not care what someone meant to do. It responds to what was actually done. Many lives are built upon intentions. Very few are built upon results. And this creates another silent exchange. People trade responsibility for explanation. Whenever failure appears, explanations appear immediately afterward. Circumstances, bad luck, timing, other people, the system, the economy, their past, their childhood, their environment. Some explanations are true. Many are partially true. But explanations possess a hidden danger. They can become substitutes for responsibility, and responsibility is one of the few forces capable of restoring control. Without responsibility, people remain trapped in reaction. They become passengers, observers, victims of movement, rather than creators of direction. This state is surprisingly comfortable. Responsibility is heavy, blame is light. Responsibility demands action. Blame demands only stories. That is why blame spreads so easily. It offers relief, temporary relief. But relief and freedom are not the same thing. Many people spend their lives pursuing relief. Few pursue freedom. Freedom requires confronting realities that relief allows people to avoid. Freedom requires uncertainty. Freedom requires accountability. Freedom requires sacrifice, and most importantly, freedom requires the willingness to stand alone. This is where many people quietly surrender, because standing alone activates ancient fears. The fear of rejection, the fear of isolation, the fear of vulnerability, the fear of becoming different. Difference carries a cost. The crowd rewards similarity. The crowd punishes deviation, not always consciously. Not always intentionally, but consistently. Every society possesses invisible boundaries, invisible rules, invisible expectations. Step beyond them and resistance appears, sometimes subtle, sometimes direct, always predictable. The crowd prefers predictability because predictability protects. collective stability. An independent thinker introduces uncertainty. A self-directed person introduces unpredictability, and unpredictability makes people uncomfortable. This discomfort creates pressure. Pressure encourages conformity. Conformity creates obedience. Obedience creates stability. Stability preserves existing power structures. The cycle repeats endlessly. Most people never notice it because they are inside it. Fish rarely notice water. Prisoners rarely notice routine. Participants rarely notice systems. Only distance reveals structure. Only observation reveals influence. Only awareness reveals ownership, and ownership is the critical word, because every decision ultimately answers one question. Who owns the direction of your life? Fear, comfort, approval, habit, expectation, or conscious choice? Most people assume ownership belongs to them automatically. It does not. Ownership must be maintained, defended, protected, reclaimed repeatedly. Otherwise, something else takes possession. Something always takes possession. Human nature dislikes emptiness. Where awareness is absent, influence enters. Where responsibility is absent, control enters. Where intention is absent, conditioning enters. And conditioning is patient. It does not need urgency. It has decades, entire lifetimes. It waits while people drift, while they postpone, while they compromise, while they convince themselves they still have time. Time is another illusion people misunderstand. Most imagine life changes through major decisions. In reality, life changes through repeated decisions. A single choice rarely transforms destiny. A repeated choice almost always does. The person who sacrifices 1 hour of thought today notices nothing. The person who sacrifices 1 hour every day for 20 years becomes someone entirely different. The difference appears invisible at first, then irreversible. That is the true danger, not dramatic destruction, gradual transformation, not losing everything, becoming someone who no longer remembers what was lost. And perhaps that is the most effective form of control ever discovered. When a person stops noticing the exchange, when surrender feels voluntary, when dependence feels normal, when the cage feels familiar, when the door remains open, yet nobody leaves. The open door is one of the most misunderstood symbols of power. People imagine control requires barriers, locks, threats, punishments. But the highest form of control does not prevent escape. It removes the desire to escape. That distinction changes everything. A person can be physically free and psychologically owned. In fact, psychological ownership is far more valuable than physical ownership. Physical force requires maintenance. Psychological influence sustains itself. Once a belief becomes internal, enforcement becomes unnecessary. The individual begins policing themselves, correcting themselves, limiting themselves, silencing themselves. The controller disappears, the control remains. This is why the most effective systems rarely rely on direct oppression. Oppression creates awareness. Awareness creates resistance. Resistance creates risk. A far more elegant strategy exists. Create incentives, shape desires, define success, and allow people to move willingly toward outcomes they believe they chose. The illusion of authorship is often enough. Human beings are remarkably protective of decisions they believe are their own, even when those decisions were carefully guided from the beginning. Especially then, because admitting influence threatens identity. And identity is one of the most fiercely defended possessions a person has. People can lose money and recover, lose opportunities and recover, lose status and recover. But when identity is threatened, something deeper reacts. The mind treats identity as survival. Question a person's beliefs and they may become uncomfortable. Question their identity and they may become hostile. Because identity is not merely what people think. It is what they believe they are. And once a system successfully attaches itself to identity, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to challenge. This is how institutions gain power, not merely through authority, through identification. People begin describing themselves through the structures that surround them, their profession, their social position, their political allegiance, their relationship status, their reputation, their tribe, their role. Gradually, the distinction between self and structure begins to dissolve. The role becomes the self, and once that happens, protecting the role feels identical to protecting existence. Observe how fiercely people defend labels. Observe how desperately they preserve images. Observe how much energy is invested in appearances. This energy is not random. It is the result of a deeper fear. The fear that beneath the role, there may be nothing. Many people never develop an independent identity. They inherit one, borrow one, purchase one, construct one from external validation. And because it was never built internally, it requires constant maintenance from the outside. Approval becomes fuel. Recognition becomes fuel. Attention becomes fuel. Without these inputs, the structure begins to weaken. This creates dependence. Dependence creates vulnerability. And vulnerability creates leverage. Every source of validation can become a point of control. Every emotional dependency can become a mechanism of influence. Every psychological need can become a bargaining chip. Power often emerges not from strength, but from understanding needs. The person who understands another's needs frequently possesses more influence than the person who possesses greater resources, because resources matter only when they connect to desire, and desire remains the true currency of human behavior. Everything returns to desire. Every empire, every institution, every relationship, every manipulation, every sacrifice, every betrayal. At the center sits desire, the need to obtain, the need to avoid, the need to become, the need to belong. People imagine they make rational decisions, but most decisions occur long before rationality enters the conversation. The emotional impulse arrives first. The explanation arrives afterward. The mind becomes a lawyer defending conclusions that were already chosen. This explains countless contradictions. People say one thing, do another, believe themselves consistent, and never notice the discrepancy, because self-awareness is far rarer than intelligence. A person can be highly intelligent and still remain completely blind to their own motivations. In some cases, intelligence makes blindness easier. The smarter the mind, the more sophisticated the justification. The more convincing the narrative, the more elegant the excuse. This creates a dangerous illusion. People believe understanding is the same as awareness. It is not. Understanding others is relatively simple. Understanding oneself is far more difficult, because self-observation requires honesty, and honesty often threatens comfort. The average person spends years constructing a story about who they are, then spends the rest of their life protecting it. The story becomes sacred. Evidence becomes secondary. Reality becomes negotiable. Anything that supports the story is welcomed. Anything that threatens it is resisted, not consciously, automatically. The mind protects identity the way the body protects wounds. This is why transformation is rare. Not because change is impossible, because honesty is expensive. Real change requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths, not about the world, about oneself, about motivations, about weaknesses, about fears, about compromises, about hidden incentives. Most people would rather preserve a flattering illusion than confront an unpleasant reality. The illusion feels safer, but safety carries a cost. Every illusion requires maintenance. Every denial consumes energy. Every avoidance creates dependency. Soon an entire life can be organized around protecting a fiction. And the larger the fiction becomes, the more terrifying reality appears. This is why some individuals become trapped inside lives they secretly despise. The truth threatens too much. The truth would require change. Change would require uncertainty. Uncertainty would require courage. And courage demands something most people avoid: Risk. Not physical risk, psychological risk, the risk of losing identity, the risk of disappointing others, the risk of standing apart, the risk of discovering that previous sacrifices were unnecessary. This final risk may be the most painful of all, because if a person admits they sold years of their life unnecessarily, they must confront regret, and regret is a ruthless teacher. Many people would rather continue a mistake than admit one. They continue relationships because ending them would expose wasted years. They continue careers because leaving them would expose wasted years. They continue beliefs because abandoning them would expose wasted years. The past becomes a prison, not because it holds power, because people refuse to release it. They become loyal to previous decisions, even when those decisions are actively damaging them. A strange form of devotion emerges. Devotion to sunk costs, devotion to familiarity, devotion to old versions of themselves. The result is stagnation disguised as consistency, and society often rewards this. Consistency sounds noble. Commitment sounds noble. Persistence sounds noble. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they are merely fear wearing respectable clothing. This distinction matters, because not all persistence is strength. Sometimes persistence is simply the inability to let go. The inability to admit reality has changed. The inability to acknowledge that yesterday's decision should not control tomorrow's future. Power benefits enormously from this confusion. The longer people remain attached to old identities, old structures, and old dependencies, the easier they are to predict. Predictability is valuable. Unpredictability is dangerous. A predictable person can be managed. A predictable person can be influenced. A predictable person can be guided toward desired outcomes. But a person willing to abandon identities, question assumptions, and reevaluate incentives becomes difficult to control. Such individuals create uncertainty, and uncertainty makes systems nervous. Every structure prefers reliability. Governments, corporations, social groups, even relationships. Reliability creates order. Order creates stability. Stability preserves power. This does not mean power is evil. Power simply behaves according to its nature. Like water flowing downhill, like fire consuming fuel, power seeks preservation, always. The question is whether the individual's interests align with the interests of the structures surrounding them. Sometimes they do. Often they do not. This conflict remains invisible because most people never examine incentives deeply enough. They evaluate appearances. Appearances are easy. Incentives require thought. Appearances tell stories. Incentives reveal motives, and motives reveal outcomes. A person who learns to observe incentives begins seeing a different world. A quieter world, a more honest world, a world beneath language, beneath promises, beneath public performances. They begin noticing why people say certain things, why institutions encourage certain behaviors, why rewards exist where they do, why punishments appear where they do. The surface disappears, the machinery becomes visible, and once the machinery becomes visible, something unsettling happens. Many of the decisions that once seemed personal begin to look engineered, not through conspiracy, through design. Every environment shapes behavior. Every structure rewards some actions and discourages others. Every system creates predictable patterns. People move according to those patterns while imagining themselves completely independent. That is the elegance of influence. The individual experiences choice. The architect experiences predictability. Neither necessarily realizes what is happening, yet the outcome remains the same. Lives slowly drift toward predetermined destinations, not because destiny exists, because incentives exist, and incentives are often stronger than intentions. A person may intend to remain free, but if every incentive rewards dependence, dependence eventually wins. A person may intend to remain honest, but if every incentive rewards deception, honesty begins to erode. A person may intend to remain themselves, But if every incentive rewards performance, authenticity slowly disappears. Not all at once, one decision at a time, one compromise at a time, one justification at a time, until eventually the person standing in the mirror appears familiar, yet strangely distant, as though somewhere along the journey, ownership changed hands, as though pieces were sold gradually, not enough to notice, never enough to cause alarm, just enough to alter direction, just enough to reshape identity, just enough to transform a life into an asset serving purposes beyond its own. And the most disturbing part is this: the transaction was never hidden. The contract was never secret. The price was visible from the beginning. Most simply never bothered to read it. In the end, most people do not lose their freedom in a single moment. They trade it away quietly, exchanging pieces of themselves for comfort, approval, certainty, and belonging. The tragedy is not that they are deceived. The tragedy is that the exchange feels reasonable every step of the way. Power rarely steals a life. It waits for the owner to surrender it voluntarily. And when people finally look back, they often discover that the life they thought they were building was actually building them, shaping their desires, defining their limits, and deciding their future long before they noticed. The question was never whether someone would influence your decisions. The question was always who, because every life is purchased one decision at a time. And by the time most people realize the price they have paid, the transaction is already complete.